What's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I'm a lawyer from New Zealand, but I'm trained in Chinese foreign policy and I work in China in an executive role. Part of my job is to follow the big macro developments coming out of China, and I throw one of these videos up every weekend where we discuss just that. Everything I say here is written by myself. I stand by my words, and I would be happy to pass on these recommendations to any paying client. So if that is something that you're interested in, please consider subscribing. For everyone else, I hope you're doing well. I'm sorry that there wasn't a regular episode last week. I was glad though that I could put up the special video that I did, and I appreciate you guys watching it and all the comments. It's been amazing. I meant everything that I said. I also want to put a special thank you to Nathan and Andrew, who within an hour or so of me setting up a Patreon page so I can make this channel 100% fan supported, they signed up with ongoing contributions. So thank you so much for that, and for everyone else, your support, your comments, your likes, everything. It is crazy amazing feeling to have that sort of support, and this is bigger than I ever thought it would be. So thank you again for that. Now, with all that said, let's push that aside and let's just jump into this episode. There's a lot to go over. It's been a very busy week. So let's look at the first story here on China Update. Earlier this week, early on Monday morning, approximately 200 police officers entered the offices of Hong Kong newspaper Apple Daily as reporters live streamed the video and arrested its owner, pro-democracy media tycoon Jimmy Lai, and several other media executives from his company Next Digital. Lai was later released on bail and said in a statement the following day, quote, "We have the support of Hong Kong people. We can't let them down," end quote. The arrests are the latest development in a string of incidents in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, provoking much concern locally and internationally, coming hot off the heels of Hong Kong authorities issuing arrest warrants for 6 activists based abroad, including one US citizen, for, quote, "incitement to secession and collusion with foreign forces," end quote, under the national security law. It should be noted here that that US citizen is colluding with his own government. And the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Chief Executive Carrie Lam, with the pandemic as a pretext, also announcing that the upcoming elections will be postponed for 1 year. Unsurprisingly, soon after the announcement, the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing approved the current LegCo session extending for another year, although it failed to cite the specific provision in the PRC Constitution, or the Hong Kong Basic Law, aka the region's mini constitution, that grants the National People's Congress Standing Committee the power to extend the Legislative Council's term. On Wednesday, the state-run People's Daily released a commentary with the title calling for the decision to postpone elections a, quote, 合宪合法合理的重要决定, or a, quote, an important decision that accords with the Constitution, the law, and with reason, end quote. France and Germany have joined other Anglophone nations by suspending or shelving the extradition treaties with the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, a decision that a Hong Kong government spokesperson described as, quote, interference in China's internal affairs and a violation of international laws and basic norms governing international relations, end quote. The Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reported on a recent survey that found that 4 out of 10 American Chamber of Commerce members are considering leaving Hong Kong due to the new national security law. On August 8th, the US Treasury Department sanctioned Chief Executive Ms. Carrie Lam and 11 others for, quote, implementing Beijing's policies of suppression of freedom of democratic process, end quote. Major Chinese lenders with operations in the United States, including Bank of China Limited, China Construction Bank Corporation, and China Merchant Bank Co., have indicated that they are moving towards complying with the US sanctions. State-run CCTV called the US sanctions, quote, extreme bullying, extremely unreasonable, and extremely shameless, end quote. Beijing responded to the Treasury Department moves by pressing sanctions of their own against top US politicians, including outspoken China critics, Senators Cruz and Rubio. In a commentary entitled, quote, sanctioning US individuals, a just move to safeguard China's interests, end quote, state-run Xinhua news agency outlined the official PRC government position, saying, quote, "The anti-China forces in the United States have long been concocting rumors and fabricating accusations, blatantly meddling in Hong Kong affairs under the pretext of human rights, democracy, and autonomy." They went on to say, quote, "They supported and used anti-China pawns like Jimmy Lai Chiying to incite violence, undermine the rule of law and social order in Hong Kong, and sabotage the city's prosperity and stability." End quote. Now, events by themselves often don't make or change history. They more often simply symbolize a shift or a process that has been underway for some time, marking a point where people point out this is where X became Y, or rather where things became more like X and less like Y on balance. The dissolution of Anglo-style freedoms of press, assembly and expression, or freedom of speech in the Anglo-American vernacular, in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region has not been a sudden change, but rather a slow erosion, which quickened in the last few months. But police searches and arrests empowered by the national security law in media offices this week, and perhaps the passing of the national security law itself, may well prove to be a symbol that marks this dissolution. Since May, General Secretary Xi Jinping has been articulating a new economic strategy, translated as, quote, "domestic circulation," end quote, which prioritizes domestic consumption and markets as China's main growth drivers, with foreign markets and technology playing more of a secondary or a supporting role. This new development model is meant to guide policymakers and local officials in future decision making. Now, we've been following this trend here for some time, for a few months now with you guys, and we should also know that this sort of model is way easier said than done. I've mentioned this new economic policy language before as well, coming from Xi Jinping for the last couple of months, but I've been waiting to get more details from the government before discussing it here in detail with you guys. But there's been a lot of attention on it in the media, so I thought it's worth just touching on it again here. Specifically, we will probably have proper details regarding this new economic policy shift, the so-called domestic circulation development strategy from Xi Jinping, when the fifth plenum meets in October. So expect lots of details at that time. But honestly, guys, this policy direction has statism written all over it. In fact, in a recent piece by The Economist, it was called a, quote, "more muscular form of state capitalism," end quote. In my mind, this all seems quite self-defeating, as domestic economic activity will need to be supported through state-owned enterprises and unsustainable public spending on fixed asset infrastructure. Just this week, for example, state-owned China State Railway Group announced its plans to double the size of China's high-speed rail network over the next 15 years. Now, all this necessitates state sector expansion and the sidelining of the types of reforms which would grow the spending power of households needed to support a vibrant domestic market. It's also worth pointing out here once again, of course, that Chinese households have seen better days. Households are already heavily leveraged, with debt to income levels being some of the highest in the world and growing several times faster than US households, for example. And just this week, the vice chairman of China's largest debt collector, YX Asset Recovery, said China is in the beginning of, quote, "an unfolding debt crisis," end quote, here referring to consumer debt. Now, flooding in the country continues into this week, and it seems to be getting worse. 13 million more acres of cropland, about the size of West Virginia, has been flooded, with over $25 billion in property damage alone and counting, and over 55 million people, the entire population of England, have been affected or seriously affected. While of course these costs are high, a serious short-term political concern is food security. That is ensuring that there isn't a surge in food prices due to a sudden supply issue, with specialized analysts estimating at least 10 million tons of rice lost, accounting for 5 to 10% of China's annual output. But this is an optimistic projection based on July data, and the situation has worsened since then. The party is very sensitive to food prices, and for good reasons. For anyone who has studied even modern Chinese history, let alone ancient Chinese history, and they will be very proactive in ensuring China is importing enough food and carefully releasing rice, soy and wheat from national reserves into the market over the next few weeks. Several Chinese academics have pointed out that China's reliance on US food imports, the food price stability, is also a strategic vulnerability that needs to be addressed over the medium to long term. On this theme, I think it's worth also discussing Chairman Xi Jinping's call to end food waste this week. Xinhua News reports, quote, calling the issue of food waste shocking and distressing, Xi, here referring to Xi Jinping, highlighted the need to maintain a sense of crisis regarding food security. Now, food waste here is referring to people not finishing their food and throwing it away. Some commentators speculate that renewed calls to reduce food waste is a sign that the leadership may be concerned about incoming food shortages. However, others push back, pointing out that Xi has discussed this issue before in the past, and that food waste is indeed a legitimate concern here in China. Now, I'm somewhat on the fence with this one, guys. I am very suspicious of crisis around every corner analysis when it comes to looking at readings coming out of Beijing. But in saying that, we're seeing some pretty extreme policy coming out in some local levels, like restricting the number of dishes people can order at group meals, for example. Though I don't think anything like that would actually be implemented in practice. And to be quite frank, we've heard calls for reducing food waste in the past. So there is some smoke, but I don't think that necessarily means that there's fire with this one. But I will keep you guys updated if I do hear anything else on the food security front. On a personal note, my experience in China is that at big group meals, especially with business or with the government, I cannot overstate how much food they provide at these banquets. It's insane. Sometimes you'll go to a meal, there'll be 5 or 6 people, and there'll be enough food to feed 40 or 50. It's crazy. That's an extreme example, but that will happen a lot. And if it's a multi-day, say, conference, this is like 3 meals a day. You're getting these massive banquets. And so this is definitely a practice that does occur, this over preparation of food, particularly for special group meals. Okay, last up, I want to talk about the US-China relationship, and then 3 special stories about the developments in that relationship. I always focus on the US-China relationship because it is simply the most important bilateral relationship in the world, the first and second largest economies, the reigning superpower in the world in the US, and the rising power in Asia. This is a relationship that has to be followed very closely, and we're in incredibly interesting times at the moment. I have thought about releasing a long-form video looking at the last 3 years of the deterioration of the relationship, and it has been a multi-year deterioration. I know that some people who don't follow China very closely, not you guys, I know, but some people, they've suddenly seen this deterioration in the China-US relationship, and they think that it's a sudden thing, or that it's only really started with the trade war, or it's only started in the last 12 months, or the last 6 months, or the last 3 months. But it's been in the work for some time, and I've actually been writing about it for several years. I wrote over 3 years ago that the China-US relationship was going to descend to the worst it's ever been since normalization began in 1979, and I laid out the reasons why I thought it was going to happen. So I've thought maybe I should do a long-form video looking at that deterioration over the last 3 years. Tell me in the comments below whether you'd like something like that, and I can look at putting it together. But I just want to touch on a couple of main points here, and then look at those important developments from this week in the relationship. We'll be looking at technology issues, Taiwan, as well as so-called Chinese public opinion towards the United States. As we should all know by now, the China-US relationship is at its worst point in modern history. And it's my view, and I've been writing about this for several years now, that the current situation in the relationship is primarily due to Chinese state overreach across the board over the last 5 years that, 1, caused a US reaction and response, and 2, severely alienated 2 key stabilizing pillars from the US side. These are the China watchers / academics / policy experts in the State Department, the academic sort of circle, as well as the business community that was operating or wanted to operate in China. And that by alienation of these stabilizing forces, this meant that there was nothing to stop the US-China relationship collapsing from that Chinese state overreach. I also believe that due to information narratives that have been created here in the mainland domestically for a domestic audience, often to distract from government mistakes, most regular citizens here, as well as much of the middle management of the government, believes that they are dealing with a ever-intensifying and completely unprovoked American/Western offensive, rather than understanding that the actions of the US and others are defensive moves in response to China's own state behavior and overreach. This system-wide fundamental misunderstanding is the lens by which officials currently view external behavior, whether from the United States or Japan or Australia or the current Taiwan administration, and they react in a manner which they believe to be reasonable and defensive, but for the rest of us looks like escalating aggression and provocative behavior. We can see this view articulated in the words of Vice Foreign Minister Le Yucheng, who said to reporters this week, China, quote, never fires the first shot, end quote, and every move China makes is, quote, self-defense and counterattack, end quote. Otherwise, quote, they will never stop undermining China's sovereignty and dignity. And I believe many people here believe this. There's been 3 major speeches over the last couple of weeks from the Director of the Foreign Office of the CCP, Yang Jiechi, the Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, as well as the previously mentioned Vice Foreign Minister, Le Yucheng. They've all given speeches over the last week or so, and all of them have been focused on foreign affairs and have touched on the China-US relationship, and all of them have placed the blame for the current US-China state of affairs 100% at the feet of the United States, and refused to recognize any wrongdoing on the part of Beijing or its current administration or any of its foreign policy decisions, behavior or words over the last few years. For not just the situation between China and the US, but also its poor relations, bilateral relationships with other actors and countries. This week, Vice Foreign Minister Le Yucheng gave an interview to Chinese media discussing the US-China relationship, and it gives us an understanding of China's official determination as to how the US and China got to this point. That argument coming from the Vice Minister is, it's all America's fault. Now, I have shortened some of these statements for brevity and translated them here for you guys. Quote, some US politicians, however, are telling packs of lies, particularly when it comes to smearing China. They do so without even the slightest trace of shame. These assertions are so fictional and preposterous that they cannot even deceive little kids. He went on to say, the US repressive moves against China have no legal basis at all. None of its actions conforms with international law, increasing tariffs, cutting off supplies to Huawei, banning TikTok, detaining Chinese citizens, selling arms to Taiwan, imposing sanctions on Chinese central government in Hong Kong, special administrative region, government officials, and closing the Chinese consulate general in Houston. And went on to say, the string of recent actions taken by the United States against China are aimed at stoking ideological confrontation and reviving the Cold War in the 21st century. It feels like the specter of McCarthyism is resurfacing in the United States. End quote. And with that, let's look at this week's major developments in the world's most important bilateral relationship. On Monday, US Health Secretary and Cabinet member Alex Azar began an official visit to Taiwan, the highest level US official to do so in 4 decades since Washington severed official ties with the island in 1979, with a meeting with Taiwan's leader Tsai Ing-wen. Rather provocatively, Mr. Azar said the purpose of his visit was to, quote, highlight the deep partnership and friendship between Taiwan and the United States, end quote. He spoke at National Taiwan University in Taipei, criticizing the PRC's behavior during the pandemic, saying, quote, the Chinese Communist Party has had the chance to warn the world and work with the world on battling the virus, but they chose not to. And the costs of that choice mount higher every day, end quote. On Tuesday, he met Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, expressing US support for Taiwan's inclusion in international health forums. During the meeting, Mr. Wu said that, quote, our lives have become increasingly difficult as China continues to pressure Taiwan into accepting its political conditions that will turn Taiwan into the next Hong Kong, end quote. On Wednesday, Mr. Azar concluded his 3-day trip, announcing that his talks with Ms. Tsai had touched on, quote, bilateral trade arrangements, end quote. That evening, Ms. Tsai said starting trade negotiations with the United States was a second-term priority for her government. I cannot underscore enough how serious a signal Washington is sending to Beijing with this visit. Taiwan is the reddest of red lines for the PRC, and the visit indicates that the US is seeking closer relations with Taipei. What is interesting, though, is the comparatively mild reaction from Beijing to the US Health Secretary's visit to Taiwan this week, with boilerplate statements being produced by relevant foreign ministry spokespeople as well as the state media. In saying that, however, the Eastern Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army did conduct military drills in the Taiwan Strait during the visit, and in a rare move, a command spokesperson made the following statement, quote, recently some major powers have persisted in a negative trend on the Taiwan issue, sending a series of negative signals to those Taiwanese independence forces and seriously threatening the safety and stability of the Taiwan Strait, end quote. On this theme, Ms. Tsai Ing-wen's cabinet is proposing a 10% increase in military spending for the calendar year. Recent executive orders coming out of the United States introduced the prospect of bans on transactions with TikTok and Wechat on national security grounds. There has been tremendous attention on the TikTok ban in the West, but this is really just small potatoes compared to a ban on Wechat as far as Beijing is concerned. The US has officially claimed that surveillance capabilities are the primary security risk. Although data from Wechat accounts registered inside and outside of mainland China are supposed to be separate, last year it was uncovered that a Chinese database was storing over 1 billion Wechat conversations, including messages from the US and other developed nations like South Korea and Japan. A study published in May by a University of Toronto Research Institute found that communications among non-China registered accounts are subject to, quote, pervasive surveillance, end quote, also. While surveillance is indeed a concern, the information dissemination capabilities of Wechat are incredibly useful to Beijing as well. Because of the popularity of Wechat, it provides a platform where Beijing has a high degree of media and thus narrative control over Chinese language discourse within the massive Chinese diaspora populations in democratic countries around the world. Just yesterday was news that ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, is being investigated for censoring content that was critical of the Chinese government on its news app in Indonesia, which is also supposed to be independent from the mainland, from 2018 until mid-2020. Now, there have been stories about people being concerned that a Wechat ban would destroy their loan bridge to friends and family in the mainland, but on this point I would only say the reason why it's the loan bridge to friends and family in the mainland is because Beijing burned down or destroyed many other bridges many years ago. The US actions against Wechat may be softened due to lobbying pressure, however, from US corporations who have financial incentives to allow Wechat transactions to continue in the United States. And while we are discussing Wechat and this idea of narrative and information control through the app, it's worth reminding ourselves how the party in China views the media and the role of the state in public opinion. A recent People's Daily Commentary series for Chinese bureaucrats discusses how to do better ideological and propaganda work in the age of COVID-19 and the role of the media as a tool of the state. This extract that I'm about to read to you guys has been translated into English, and I've shortened it for brevity. Some of the things discussed in the document for Chinese bureaucrats was, quote, once the tool of public opinion is not in the hands of the party and the people, it will not be guided by the will and the interests of the party and the people, and its harm and misfortune are unimaginable. The Western media are in the hands of a capitalist monopoly and under the control of private wealth, so they cannot be objective and impartial, quote, public instruments of society, end quote. They went on to say, media convergence is an important way to penetrate public opinion field online and offline. In recent years, the major media has rushed to the internet. And Comrade Mao Zedong once said, a fine pen is as useful as 3,000 good soldiers. Carrying out the struggle for public opinion is of great significance to grasp the leadership and initiative of public opinion guidance work. In the face of the current information political opinion situation, if we admit to being wishy-washy, we will be tongue-tied. If we lose our voice, we'll be scolded. we should dare to struggle and be good at struggling so as to overwhelm the enemy in terms of momentum and morality. During the news pandemic, some countries stigmatized China and tried hard to shrug off their own responsibility for not fighting the epidemic, taking China as a scapegoat. We launched a public opinion campaign with a clear-cut banner, refuted them with reasoned arguments, exposed their lies, and let the world see their despicable acts and ugly faces. End quote. Okay, last up, the last story for China-US developments, and this is Chinese public opinion of the United States. Now, there are these poll results going around the Chinese internet this week indicating Chinese public opinion of the United States is at its worst point in modern history. This is actually anecdotally probably true, but let's look at what these polls say first. The polls claim to have had 150,000 respondents, so let's have a look at some of these findings. So I'll put the first one up. Let's look at the first one. It says here, number one, the US has imposed sanctions on 11 officials, including Carrie Lam, blah, 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 blah. What is your view of this action by the United States? And of this 150,000 people polled, 75% said gross interference in China's internal affairs, 20% said a bluff, the Trump administration's presidential campaign, and probably less than 5%, maybe 2 or 3% said a show of support for democracy and freedom in Hong Kong, and a few percent there said they're not sure. The next question that was published this week in China: do you support China in taking countermeasures against the US provocations? Notice again, provocations here. We were discussing this before. 65%, or just under, say firmly support it as it's a matter of national dignity and fundamental interests. 31%, yes, as China is able to strike a balance between countering provocations and opening up. Just 2.1% said no, China should put patients first and the priority should be opening up. Less than 1%, no, China should accept all US demands. And just over 1.5, 1.6 there said not sure. And finally, the main one, do you like the US? Do you like the United States? Less than 3%, yes. 36% approximately, never liked it. 30.8% used to, but less so now. And 27% say fond of its advanced science and technology as well as its rule of law, but not its policies against China. And just under 3.5% said not sure. Now, while this is very, very interesting to look at, we need to take this with several grains of salt. First of all, this was an online poll. It was not a scientific sampling of the population. The fact that it's online is a big red flag, since there are literally hundreds of millions of Chinese people who don't have access to the internet. And two, the poll was posted to the online account of the Global Times, an ultra-nationalistic, though very popular publication. So the data is more of a reflection of the views of its audience members who feel strongly enough about the subject to take the time to do an online poll. With all that said, however, I can say anecdotally, anti-foreign feelings here seem to be at fever pitch, and they're certainly the worst I've ever experienced in my several years in the country by a long shot. Okay guys, that's our episode. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your support. Make sure you like and share if you think there's someone that might like this content. If you do want to contribute and keep this fan supported, the link to my Patreon is just below. But at any rate, thank you so much for your support and for watching. I hope you're staying safe and staying sane wherever you are, and I will see you all next time on China Update.